Online teaching. Hi folks, this is Anthropology and the Human Condition, lecture number 9 on the 17th of November, a Wednesday, and welcome. So today we're talking about digital anthropology, new global blah blah blah. See The reading was Sarah Pink's essay on applied visual anthropology, social intervention, visual methodologies in anthropological theory, where she talks about new methodologies and practices specific to projects that have got some kind of social intervention determined by needs of groups, and it's basically making videos, films or photo projects, digital edited films because they're more available, for activist groups or NGOs or things like that. A very interesting read and worthwhile. But I'm not really going to talk directly about that. That's the background. I'm a bit inspired also by our discussion yesterday. If I saw some of you in the discussion, if you want to see what that was, it was a talk by Professor Paul Favero from the University of Antwerp, and it's available now on my blog, Trinketization. Let me just see if I can put the link into the, I will be able to put the link into the chat for you right now. So I don't just copy it. I don't expect you to go off and watch it now. It's an hour, a 30-minute, it's called 30-minute methods, but it's a 30-minute talk and 30 minutes discussion. There's another one next Tuesday at 4 o'clock again, and it's Dr. Ken Ferro, who's an award-winning filmmaker, made Injustice in 1999 and just recently Ultraviolence, which is an update, and very much the kind of filmmaking that Sarah Pink should be talking or will be talking about. Social interventionist film done in a, he wouldn't call it visual anthropology, but I think the best of visual anthropology aspires to be like that film Ultraviolence. And it really is a message film from an older generation of anti-racist activists to a younger generation coming up and getting involved. And it's really important because it documents some of the history of anti-racist campaigning against deaths in police custody, which in England is a huge problem. Right, 1,000 or so, or no, more than 1,000 people have died in police custody in Britain, and with no charges of, well, murder. It should be murder charges, but not even manslaughter or lesser charges put against the police. And really, the fundamental thing about this is the police have a duty of care once you get arrested, no matter what you've done. If you've done something, and often people get arrested without doing something, you don't prejudge. You should at least stay alive if you've been arrested. You shouldn't get killed after the police have arrested you. And if you do, that means negligence on the, not negligence, criminal activity on the part of the cops, and they should be prosecuted. Never have been. So the film's about that. Ken Ferro is talking about things like that. The following week, so getting on to the 30th of November, there's also a talk, and this time it's by Jack Bolton, and he's a former student of mine, who now works at Leuven in Belgium. And he's going to talk about the literary in anthropology and writing, but as a more literary dimension. So really interesting stuff. So you can find the information about those talks as well on my blog as ever, and various other places on Facebook and so on, probably on the departmental page as well of our faculty, and just now on the chat here. So, right, that's the preamble, although it's very much a part of what we're talking about. I mean, especially Paulo Favero, his talk yesterday, where he kind of rambled a bit from topic to topic, but he's really thinking about what it means to be an anthropologist at a time when all sorts of new technology has become available for anthropologists to use. And previously, anthropologists were kind of anathema. You know, they pretended television didn't exist. No, you never read about telephones or television, or rarely anyway, you read about this stuff in ethnographic accounts. Like, nobody had a TV, you'd think, or didn't even mention tourists, right? Although, of course, as we've been saying from the very beginning, Malinowski arrived with a camera, and that's a piece of technology, and no doubt the recording equipment of microphone and cassette tape is very important for doing anthropology and ethnography. But there's a sense, at least for Paulo Favero, there's a sense in which the new technologies, and in particular he focused on two: the drone, camera attached to a drone, which is interesting, and 360-degree photography as a way of, rethinking the role of technology and ethnography at the same time. He started talking about dronography, right? I don't know whether he's written anything about this yet and what that will entail, but I imagine it should. If you're going to talk about drones, talk about the way in which drones are also a weapon, right? He had some great footage because he's been flying drones with a camera and trying to see what they say about being human, right? So he's looking at, I suppose, patterns in the landscape, and he was chasing flamingos, which is really quite interesting. Because you imagine like trying to fly with flamingos in a flock. Some beautiful footage. But I'm thinking the whole time, these flamingos are trying to fly away from the drone, really, because the drone's quite a noisy thing, right? For buzzing, what are they called? Rotors, making quite a noise, chasing after birds. They're going to flee, or as happened once when seagulls attacked the drone, he lost one. That's pretty funny. But he's thinking through what it means to have these new technologies, and I guess so should we think about. But I think we need to take on how the issues of distribution are also changed in the situation of new technologies, because really it's not just suddenly anthropology's gone visual. We've always had that. Malinowski arrived with the camera, remember, and there's always been visual anthropology, but it became a discipline, a proper section of the discipline, say in the 80s, but it was always there. There were filmmakers since the early days. Jean Rouch, we watched some of that early on. But what's changed is the platforms in which it's distributed. So it used to be quite hard to find copies of ethnographic films, like difficult to get copies and show them in classes. And now it's just a few clicks and YouTube can give you, like the Crazy Masters, Jean Rouch's film that we looked at. And until 2 or 3 years ago, even that was only you had to pay to get a copy. So it's only now that a lot of things are being distributed. And of course, I'm talking about distribution platforms. You've got to think about TikTok and Instagram and things like that, how that circulates images. And because it's digital, there's also a kind of redundancy in photography and film that didn't exist before, right? And by that I mean you take your photos on your camera about just take a small portrait of someone. You'll take 10 or 15 and pick the best one and throw the rest away. That used to be what you did with a SLR or a 35mm camera as well, but it was a little bit expensive to do that because you had to print them to see if they were any good. With a digital, or at least look at the negatives, and with a practiced eye, you could perhaps decide which one was good, but not really. And so there was a little bit of redundancy, but not like now, where I don't know if you practice photography like I do. If I go into my photo app, where is it, and find the recently deleted file, oh my God, it's all the bad photos, but there's quite a lot. There's 75 photos deleted, right? And they are didn't even show. Right? Maybe I will. Let me see. They're kind of bad shots of my face or my kids. Ones that I didn't choose were the ones where everyone was smiling, even though we have part of the app is it focuses on when the subject smiles. There's also ones with my daughter lost a tooth, and chuck them away, forget about them. And there's thousands and thousands over the month. So every month 100 photos being thrown away. That kind of redundancy didn't used to exist. So there's that. And of course, attention span for TikTok or for YouTube, even Facebook, the platforms through which we even watch YouTube now are emphasizing this redundancy, because it shows you film after film after film, and when you watch one, then the next one is already queued up, ready to go, unless you actively turn it off. Come and say hello, because I know you want to. This one's the daughter. All right, now go, and please don't make a noise. Sorry, they really want to be in the game of being, that's another different dimension, right? We previously wouldn't have had that kind of throwaway moment where everyone wants to have a selfie and you take hundreds of them and never look at them again, pretty much, except for the one or two each year that you think show you in your best light, right? And that's another weird dimension of the digital. So this is maybe, like Paolo says, a new era, the digital mode of production. And my question will be, or is it a brief blip? What does it really change? Now in anthropology, maybe there's a faster circuit of feedback, right? So there was already a circuit of feedback, so that you could, in a book like Sidewalk by Mitchell Dunier, great book, Sidewalk. He did a study of street sellers on New York streets, right, selling magazines and so on. And in that ethnography, he gave the people who he was writing about chapters to read, and they commented on them before they went into the book. So there was a feedback loop, but now, even if you do your field work far away, that feedback can be done very quickly. It used to be that you had to, you published the book and you had to make a special trip to carry the book back to the people. Now you can send drafts, you can send a copy electronically, instantaneous connection. And in fact, the fieldwork can go on and on. You can do your fieldwork and then stay in touch with everyone. And some people don't even go to the field anymore because they do their fieldwork, so-called fieldwork, online. so-called fieldwork online because we're all a bit skeptical still, but we shouldn't be, I suppose. What's to say that online is less real or something than in person, in fact, as I saw recently. Somebody meant in person, but they put in fact, a meeting in fact, rather than in this, fiction of digital. That's an assumption and an evaluation, a value-loaded assumption. Yeah, what's this? So I've included some bits of handwriting in here because, why? Because these are examples of my notes or a book, writing a book, but also because I wanted to think about how handwriting was already digital. We call them digits, for a reason. They are for counting, but handwriting is part of the apparatus, the technology of a pen or chalk or I don't know, chisel and stone, whatever, of representing, of making text. And the digital then is not that new, and everyone knows this. About maybe we kind of pretend to ourselves that things are new when things are not really that new. For example, the informants being informed, being able to communicate through various means is not a new thing. One thing Paolo said yesterday that I thought was interesting and wrong was that he said that our informants now are much better at representation than we are, and that's a new thing. Informants being the people studied by anthropologists, right? And I thought, no, that's probably not true. When Malinowski arrived in the Trobriands, he was making pretty bad photographs, out of focus, as we've seen, and trying really hard. And the Trobrianders really knew about representation. They decorated their boats, they decorated themselves, and Malinowski wasn't so self-aware, right? He's strutting around, well, he was sort of aware, strutting around in his white colonial suit, right? I guess he was aware of the impression he was making, but he wasn't very critical of it. I can't assume that the Trobrianders were critical of it, but they certainly knew about representation, and they put on performances and displays, and so it's nothing new that the people that anthropologists write about are also good at writing. Think of Levi-Strauss and the Nambikwara guy, or good at representation. People represent culture to themselves. That's kind of what culture is. It's making meaning and representing it in forms that can be conveyed to another person. But it is the case, and what's different, why I say distribution is a factor to consider. It is the case that the relationship in time seems faster, given these new technologies, right? Although I also want to question this. Right? Let me put it to you. Do you think things are speeding up? Do you think that digital has meant that life has sped up under the contemporary cultural conjuncture? The current moment, the state we're in capitalism today, have things, has culture become, as transmission, as there more? I think this idea is a bit of hype, because globally, for I would say 20 years, but certainly for 10, international since 2008 economic crash, well, I would say 30 years, but 10 anyway, international capital has been slowing down. It's been stagnant. It hasn't been moving, in fact, except for like 2 or 3 countries that have a few digits growth. Everywhere else has been in recession or Like Britain is desperate to say it's not in recession because it's got 0.01 growth compared to Vietnam, 4%, 6%, whatever. A few years back, 7. China 7, a few years back 15. Right? The huge economies like America and Japan have been in stagnation since the mid-90s. And some of the big Asian economies as well, since the 1997 Asian crash, the Soros crash, right? Capital has been not moving, not expanding, and so not getting faster. It desperately tried to find in high tech a new boost, but then there was a high tech crash. The high tech bubble collapsed in 2000 as well. I mean, it's slowly clawed its way back, and there's some fictional money in the system now. You know, Facebook is worth, Meta, changed its name, Meta Facebook, whatever, is worth ballooning billions of money, and Google and Amazon and so on. But these are not real numbers. They are stock market numbers, and a crash can wipe off billions, as you might see in fictional accounts like Succession and so on. But the thing is, right, there's even the technology, when you think about what it does, is it speeding your life up? Now, you can get in touch with people instantaneously with a phone, right? And that's what this thing supposedly is. We call it a phone, but actually we use it, at least I use it, less often as a phone, more often as a diary, clock, for email, a camera, and a few other apps that I use, right? I don't know, fitness app, let me see, what do I use? Banking, and putting up pictures of cats on Facebook, and Zalo, right, for messaging. But does it mean that things are speeding up? Actually, messaging, texting, we've got this jitter thing with our thumbs, right? If you do it like that, is slower when you think about it than talking to someone on the phone. You ring someone and they answer, right? That's sped up communication, right? Whereas if you email someone, it sits in their inbox or their in tray, or a text arrives. Maybe it goes ping and they answer it. Maybe it goes ping and they say, no, I'm not answering that yet. That's slower than a phone call. And we've had phone calls for 100 years or more. So this idea of email has transformed everything, and the communication is speeding up seems to me slightly not quite right, because what I enjoy about the current situation is people won't call me, pretty much. Students don't call me. You don't call me. You might email me and I can answer that when I feel like it. Usually 3 a.m. because that's when I can't sleep and I'm working, right? But I don't have to answer. I often do, but I don't have to answer right away. Whereas if you call me, I don't give out my number, right? I kind of have to answer straight away, and you've got me wherever I am. So actually this device, rather than having me on all the time, which is what people fear, actually serves to set up a barrier between being able to be having to be on all the time. Isn't it the case? Am I missing something here? Right? There is definitely a talk, people complaining about new technology has meant that you're on all the time. But actually, I think the technology has slowed down or it's changed that problem, right? I used to give out my phone number to my classes. I mean, people didn't ring me all the time. It wasn't considered ethical or appropriate, but they could. And people rang during office hours, right? They would ring. You would have a set hour when people could ring you up, and we don't do that now. So this question of things sped up, faster loop, there seem to be some problems that we have to take into account. That globally capitalism is in slump, so not as much as moving. I mean, let alone we haven't even assessed the impact of COVID stopping the logistical shipping of all the different lanes and whatnot. The cargo, the carriers, the ports are clogged with cargo that's not moving. Right? Stagnation under COVID has been exacerbated, but I'd say if you look at the large economies since the mid-90s, you see that that's the normal. Stagnation for a decade or 3 decades, recession for a decade, 3 decades of stagnation. And then there's ideology or hype about technology, everything speeding up. Well, you know, we had faxes 150 years ago. We had phones 100 years ago. Photography is 150 years ago. So it's not that the things have sped up. Maybe the density of our relationships is different because I don't much talk to my neighbors. I mean, I do, but a couple of them, but not all of them. And perhaps not in everyone generally across the planet doesn't talk to their neighbors as much as they used to, where everyone knew your business. But I do talk to my family every day when they're in another country. And I do talk to the people in this other building, and I do talk to the people that I know in Germany and in England quite often. So the density of my communication, if you plotted the network, has shifted. It's a much broader and global map, if you like, of the density of my communications. But its immediacy to where I live and community has changed. I mean, yeah, I get a lot of messages about the building and the administration of the building and stuff, but I don't much hear from the community. Actually, that's not completely true in this time of COVID, because there have been a lot of communications from the house manager, the building supervisor, and so on. But still, I think it's true that the majority of my communications are not with my neighbors, and they would have been if I lived in a village, or they would have been 40, 30 years ago. In fact, I'm sure they were. My workplace, for example, I hardly ever see nowadays my colleagues except in the staff meeting. Right, whereas previously, we all lived on top of each other. We have a communal office as well, which was unusual. We had to, in the old days, have separate offices just to get that space so you could have your meetings. So I think there's something to be questioned about the way in which people talk about the digital and its hype, right? So that's another reason why I wanted to include some bits of handwriting as examples and reminders, I guess, to myself. Although I'm not asking you to read my handwriting. I can read it, but probably no one else can, and it's not anywhere near as neat as you all, right? But I do want to talk about this crisis, why the digital matters in a context where capital is stagnant and capital has long been in crisis, right? It barely moves, despite the rhetoric of hyperactivity, all right? Things are slowly trundling along, despite a talk of just-in-time production and massive logistical connections, and it's since the 60s, really, 60s bubble, there's been a slowing down of creativity in the markets, and fear, retreat, a pulling back from the economy as something that boomed and was booming with, I don't know, 30 years ago we talked about the Asian tigers and all this Singapore and Taiwan, their economy, but they're tanking as well. It's because the bubble, the population bubble of the baby boomers, right, has coincided with technological anxiety of the West, I suppose, starting from the Opec oil crisis, I think in the 70s, related, of course, to the end of colonization, but also the OPEC oil-producing countries put America on notice, and you've been benefiting from our oil and this colonial relationship, but no more. And they stored their barrels, right? They put America over the barrel, so to speak, with what was it, the Iran hostage crisis. They got Reagan elected, got rid of Ford. Ford after Nixon, right? Ford was no, it's not Ford, was it? It was Ford was after Nixon. Then came the peanut farmer. What's his name? Still alive. The president before Reagan was called, he farmed peanuts. My God, my brain no longer remembers anything, does it? Who was the president before Jimmy Carter? Crikey, there he is. Let me show you Jimmy Carter. Why can't I get a photo of him? Oh my God, he's really old now. All right. I have to go out of my slide to do that. It's not really super convenient, is it, to do? Let me stop presenting and then present a page. You should be able to do that automatically without this two-stop thing. But here's Jimmy Carter, and that's how he was when he was president. And what are the flags? Stars and Stripes, yeah. And now he looks like a dodgy old geezer. Well, he's got a black eye here. Yes, he's got some injury. I wonder what happened. Released from hospital. The peanut farmer served as the 39th president of the United States. I bet you he wasn't just a peanut farmer. Yeah, he's quite elderly, and he's done some great things, I must say. Of all the presidents, it was a bit scary at the time. Look at this smiley face. That's just scary. But subsequently, he's been one of the sensible ex-presidents. Yeah. Lives in 167,000. What? He lives in 160. I suppose that's considered cheap for a US president. Anyway, the crisis of that economy the OPEC crisis is the sign of or the beginning of the stagnation and slump, the downturn in the American and then in fact the global economy, a long downturn that coincides with and the end of formal colonialism and the end of the baby boom. Well, the baby boom is coming into power, but the slow decline. So places like, why are the Asian tigers no longer talked about in the same way? It's because their population is aging. There's not as many younger people, for example. I know, and that has effects in all sorts of fields. Consider education, right? So Taiwan is now, you might have noticed as students now, is now a destination country for Vietnamese students to go and do their master's or PhD. Right? You know that a couple of our staff members have left TDTU to go and do a PhD in Taiwan. And that's in part because Taiwan has been pushing to have international students as its own population that used to have like 90% of them go to university is now smaller. So there are many more universities with lots of space. They need to, in order to keep filling the space, to grow, they need to capture international students. The same for Japan. Why has Nagoya University, for example, set up in Hanoi? Like Japanese universities didn't have any interest before in international education. They weren't. They had a few people come in from overseas, but it wasn't a big push. And now they also have franchise campuses here in Vietnam and in Cambodia, and let alone the other franchise campuses like RMIT from Melbourne and elsewhere. These are because the bubble of the 60s generation, the boom, they've finished their education now and they've left. And universities have sort of got empty nest syndrome. You know this phrase? Empty nest is when parents have got a big house and the kids leave to get their own house, right? And so you've got empty rooms, empty nest. So universities are similar. And they have to try and fill them with international students. Of course, there aren't enough international students to go around as countries realize that they should educate their own. Like I think Vietnam is realizing, India had realized. Some 30 years ago, Indians went overseas for higher degrees, classically. But then the Indian government put a massive investment in higher education within the country and developed PhD programs. And so a lot of Indians, still a lot go overseas, but a lot do their education in country now. And the Vietnamese government also has been pushing for higher education within the country. It makes sense. Why allow your best and brightest students to leave for their 4 or even longer years that it takes them to do a PhD, their most creative years? Why have them go and do that creativity elsewhere? Why not have them contributing to the country? Anyway, that 60s. So this crisis as well, this stagnation, this lack of movement is going to extend because of the climate crisis, migration crisis, urban crowding. Like we've got some contradictory elements because of the stagnation. People do want to move, but they want to move from places where there are no opportunities because there's no growth to the few places, the metropolitan centers, where the privilege of the elite keeps the semblance of growth going. So the big urban attractor centers like Ho Chi Minh City is one, but especially London and New York and Paris and things like that are dragging people from the moribund parts of capital into the center. So there's urbanization in all countries, but that's an economic drive. And then this will be exacerbated by climate migration, climate refugees, as we also have in Ho Chi Minh City, people moving from the Delta because of salinization, siltation, the salt water is coming further and further up the river. People are leaving their livelihoods that had developed post-war and coming in to live in the cities like Canto and Ho Chi Minh City and Cà Mau and stuff. So, you know, there's movement in the system, but not growth. And it's a kind of stagnant movement. It's static, you know, and I think it's symbolic that we put a lot of hype into the digital, but that doesn't really do much more than redistribute the density of our relationships. And of course, once the relationships are being redistributed, if we look at how they're working, community is breaking down in place, but is being strengthened as a kind of, I want to kind of say it's no longer a community in space, but a community in time, or an identity slot, right? Which is almost like a time slot when your TV program is on or something. You don't necessarily know all the people in your immediate vicinity, but you're in touch with all the people that tune in to a certain kind of style of event, whether it be an identity event or some kind of institutional program. Think of how subcultures now operate in a much wider density than in a place. It used to be that a subculture, you went to a certain street in the city where the people of your clique would hang out. And now it's a site or a time slot on radio or television or on a live streaming site or something, where you'll find your like-minded identity brothers and sisters. And these are the rearrangements of relationships. The relations of production of capital are now being rearranged to no longer be based in communities, hence migration of labor and hence the formation of attachments to identities that are not always work identities, of course, but that's a part of it too. So that you will become a tech worker and be able to move from science park to science park. And urbanization is a part of that. So there's lots of aspects to this digital that, well, I think that in the talk we had yesterday from Paolo, there were some great questions being brought up, but we only got to touch on some of these issues a bit. But I think there are real dilemmas for thinking about how we talk about, how we write about the digital, because there's this hype around it. Right? How does it change the scene of ethnography? Is worth thinking about. Right? How does it change? I know note taking and going to do field work. I mean, again, this speed question might be an issue. The speed at which you do field work, the speed at which you can write notes was always a factor. How many notes did Malinowski have to take of a day, and how many do you have to write every day? Do you have to do field work every day? If you're in the field in a year, set kind of the model of going to do field work, you go to have a look for yourself. You did every day because you were living the life on site, so to speak. But now with travel, international travel as it is, also stagnant right now, but you can go back and forth to the field site, and now you can go electronically to the field site. I mean, now it feels like that means there's even more that you can do, and there's even too much to read, and so on. But I think, again, it's a density of relationships where, and selectivity of what you read. I mean, I don't know. It's something I am suspicious of in myself. When I think, oh God, people don't read anymore. Damn. I think that just sounds like my dad when he was complaining about me when I was a kid or teenager or whatever. That music's too loud. Stop it now. I feel like an old geezer, right? Saying people don't read anymore. Of course people read, and they watch more films now than they used to. But is it that they don't contemplate the films in the same way? Has your relationship to documentary or to video changed? And one question I asked in my media course is, how has forms of delivery of film, visual anthropology, for example, but how do forms of documentary get delivered via these platforms like Facebook and I suppose TikTok. They're done in a way where the film itself is more disposable. You watch it and pass on, move on to the next thing. The next is really privileged. Whereas when I've been watching recently some older documentaries for that course, a lot of them seem really slow. Right? They seem slow from here because, why? Because we have a hyper speed, because we're wanting the next thing, and people say that's what's happened to us. So we've all become consumers of the next thing, and almost like our attention is flitting from thing tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. Like that's really your attention flitting from one thing to another, not contemplating and not slowing down. I think that's hype, right? But what's happening there is your attention is on all the time, but there's not any depth, there's not any density. The density is different, I guess. Right? So you don't stay with a film, and I mean, some films affect you. Some TikTok films can surely affect you, and you remember it, and they go viral, and you see them too often. God, I mean, how many times did we watch the wash your hands video, right? But there's certainly a greater redundancy of images and films, so we dismiss them. Whereas when they were rarer, when they were less, a different density, I guess, you stayed with things. You stayed with your community of film, the films you knew longer. Now it's what's new. I mean, it was always what's new, I guess, but that's a big part of it anyway. So what's this crisis about, really? I mean, this is where we start to leave anthropology, I suppose, and get to philosophy. This epoch, well, anthropologists are talking about logistics, and they're talking about climate, and they're talking about the Anthropocene and apocalypse and environmental catastrophe and basically the end of the world. That's kind of, you know, we've seen too many movies where there's the apocalypse is happening. It's a post-apocalyptic nightmare, and there are still anthropologists, and there are still libraries, and there are still, right? So the library might be buried in 400 foot of snow, and nobody's actually sitting around reading. They're burning the books to survive. I'm thinking of the film 2012, I think. Oh, that was ages ago. That used to be the future. But yeah, anthropologists are facing this kind of end times, but that also is a bit like the hype of the digital, right? On the one hand, you also have, there's environmental climate change activists, and anthropologists are involved in that as well, like COP26 and so on. On the one hand, and then there's others who are hyping up the creative economy and the importance of artists and of you know, attention theory as a buzz, right? As a positive thing, part of the creative economy and so-called cognitive capitalism, which sounds like a better kind of capitalism because it's smarter. Or a more critical Marxist take on it has been the immaterial capitalism critique of Hart and Negri, and so on. But this global economy is the context in which anthropologists are now thinking their ethnographies. So the density in which anthropologists work somehow challenged and changed a little, right? If you think of how Evans Pritchard or someone like that was working with the community, even as they were thinking about world wars and the global. Now the the context is much more global and post-global in a way, the end of the world, and that shapes how even the local is slotted into that, so that you can have multi-site locals, many locals as part of the field work in the global economy, or the Google economy, the digi, giga, meta, anthropo, hyper, ocene economy, right? The obscene economy, if you like. I mean, this is part of a trajectory. We can plot this, of course. Everyone knows this stuff, beginning with Taylorism. Think about the time slots of Taylorism, right? Taylorism, the trained monkey, the skilled worker and the mass worker. And the difficulties with that were that people would take time out, and that affected the process. The skilled worker didn't come to work one day, and there was trouble. There was contradictions, and this is where criticism came in of the factory and its the misery of the factory, right? And people wanted to escape it. The coherent rationalization or the streamlining of the factory happens with Fordism, the production line, right? The assembly line, production in a line. The image of Charlie Chaplin in modern times on that production line is the classic of that. But at the same time, we have in that scenario, the worker as the consumer, right? Ford was all about getting the workers to buy cars, basically, and they could buy any car they wanted in any color, as long as it was black and as long as it was a Ford. And there was a stable demand for commodities from these workers. They weren't dirt poor factory workers anymore. They were paid a bit better in these production line factories, Fordism and so on, because they were paid sufficient to create an economy. So there would be consumption. And of course, that meant that there were haves and have-nots, and had competition amongst the haves as well to see who had the latest Ford motor car or whatever other companies. Competition was huge, and of course proceeded through innovation. The next Ford with headlights, or with, I don't know, trying to think of what innovations there were in the order of innovations. I don't know. No longer a crank starter, a key starter or something like that. The next big change, of course, is Keynesianism. Post-war, World War boom, I suppose, the science parks and so on might be discussed in there, but Keynesianism, wage workers, national productivity, these kind of big algorithmic ways of thinking about the economy, which leads eventually via science parks into transnational production, where, of course, if there's waged workers, then companies seek to economize on the costs of production. They look for workers that are going to work for lower wages. And where that leads directly into financialization and globalization, because lower workers are overseas. This drives digitization, because you need to have better accounting if your workers are overseas. You need to track them better. You need to have deliveries, or what became Toyotaism, delivery just in time. Toyota was like Fordism, but distributed, spread all over the world. So different parts are made in different places and then shipped and assembled on the assembly line still. But the benefits of having headlights made in the Philippines and mudguards made in Indonesia were that those workers there doing those jobs were cheaper, and then shipping could bring all the pieces to Nagoya, where Toyota is, the largest port in the world, accepting all these bits of mass-produced vehicle and assembling them there. So after a transnational company, or instead of transnational company, we should have a second stage maybe called Toyotaism. But here I'm talking about, I mentioned cognitive capitalism. the guy's work who I'm thinking of that tops this, that ends up at the next step, is Mulya Boutang, who's a French theorist. I don't know if he's actually French himself, but he's working in France. And he put forward the concept of the beverage state, right? A new mode of capitalism that I think we should attend to in Ho Chi Minh City, because it takes the coffee house as a kind of model, which is interesting. He doesn't mean a coffee house like the ones we have in Ho Chi Minh City. He means the chain, Starbucks or Seattle Coffee Company or something. We have some chains, so sure, but they're not super. Well, local chains are becoming something, right? Whatever, Win, I can't even remember the company name. I just remember the logos. Longfook and Win, whatever. Anyway, this coffee that you would be crazy to go and have, because it's 120,000 dong per cup or something like that. But this franchise system of capital is the franchise model is something that Mulya Boutang sets out as a new stage of capital with quantitative financing. So you're subcontracting a part of your operation to a whole number of franchises, and they are looking for the cheapest workers possible, and they benefit from the fact that in this system there's mass unemployment and people looking forward to getting out of the stagnation through some kind of step up through working as a what's it called, well, it used to be a soda jerk, and now it's called a barista, right? Kind of upmarket slave inside one of these chains, but nonetheless kind of with a cultural cachet of kind of new cool, or it's not very, but an attempt to be cool anyway, of interpersonal relations. The company Starbucks is classic for this, referring to its customers by a single name, and referring to its staff members by a single name, and putting its customers' names on the product, right? Completely mass anonymous thing, coffee, right? Or it could be Coca-Cola as well, with individuals' names on them, to try and break the impersonal, or to counteract the impersonal nature of mass commodification. Getting a Coca-Cola with your name on it. I've got one that says John. I've got one that says Mao as well somewhere. Or having the Starbucks person refer to you, coffee for John, and it's like, oh, gee, hi, have a nice day. When nobody really, coffee becomes a way of doing associated business. Of course, beverage capitalism is that. And the model, we see it on the streets, right? You start up as just on the street with your own cart, basically. And the ideal would be that you're able to then have a few carts, and then a couple of dozen carts, and eventually you go into shops and you start your own chain, and you become the Seattle Coffee Company, or the new version, Win Long Chung or whatever it was called, right? And it's all about the hype of doing that cottage capitalism, which will scale up to be a global chain, right? A global chain of offering people an extra shot with their beverage that they get in any location. You know, often in bookshops, where it used to be that a bookshop sold books. Now more than half of God, it's happening here. It's slowly. In a way, Ho Chi Minh City bookshops are behind the trend in not all being cafes already. But I see even Fahasa in Lotte has now reduced the space for books in Fahasa to about 1/3. They haven't introduced coffee yet, but they've certainly introduced toys. They always had stationery, and that made sense. But it's mostly a toy shop now, huge toy shop, and knickknacks and Halloween stuff and so on. And the books are kind of jammed up into one corner, and it's very weird that there's older modes of petty bourgeois economy. A bookshop is a petty bourgeois production, and now turned into chains and are now being taken over by coffee chains, in fact. It's certainly the case in London, where really it's the coffee that gets people into the bookshop rather than the books. And this is matched by the kinds of training and the divisions of people into alpha, beta, and grunt workers. And the idea that you can shift from one state to another because we have lifelong learning, and you can always at any stage in your life somehow win the lottery of turning some aspect of your skill set into a global chain, right? Whether it be getting that final contract for the novel that we've all got in us, or starting a small business and having that expanded. In the meantime, most of us actually are still working in institutions that are pretty moribund, desperate to get some kind of institutional turnover, and even often replacing wages with the ability to get credit, right? That's the benefit of these systems, right? And all in all, that strikes me as being exactly what Marx and Engels had pointed out already in the manifesto: proletarianization. We're all getting put into the same stagnant boat where we have a certain set of skills, which is we can serve and we can stand at a counter pressing buttons. And I don't think that's distinguishes necessarily an engineer or a physics worker from someone who works in a coffee shop, because we're all at a keyboard and we're all governed by targets, and we're all watched. We have productivity targets that we have to meet. We have to do a certain work rate and so on. And we use very, very similar and even interchangeable skills. And productivity gain is the almighty driver, and the stress that comes from that is similar whether you work in high tech or you work in sales. And resistance has gone by the way, actually. At best, resistance is just resistance to the surveillance, to get away with something. Right, and in some ways that goes back to the old resistance of shirking off at work, but I don't know. And of course, all of this time, this is covered over by the hype that somehow in some industry, whether it be high tech or be financing and so on, you can get the fast money and the big money and become the heroes of industry that are presented to us in the magazines, right? Zuckerberg and so on, these billionaires who pulled themselves up from nothing. They used to work in a garage and now they earned their way to be billionaires. But of course, when you do the math, to become a billionaire, you need to earn something like $50,000 per hour for 500 years to make billions, right? I can't remember exactly the math, but if you do the math, the amount per hour you have to earn to become as rich as the Zuckerbergs and so on, if you're earning it as a wage, is impossible for a human to do, right? It would take too many years. So there must have been some kind of fast money theft. And that's not available to all of us. We simply can't all do that. So it's a deeply unequal and I think largely stagnant system. Of course, that's where again, Marx's concepts are quite important for anthropologists. You've got to think of how this system, albeit in stagnation, is actually hiding, has appropriated all the creativity of what it is to be human and sequestered that behind a firewall of proprietary ownership. Companies own the knowledge. We're in the university is all about open and free knowledge, but increasingly researchers work for companies where you're simply not allowed to make public your knowledge. So the sciences are now working for, often in science parks, for commercial operations, working in labs run by companies. And the principle of sharing knowledge goes against the logic of corporate science because they want to have the latest stuff as patented, as proprietary, as secret formula, right? So human creativity is now being owned and sequestered behind firewalls. So this was where Marx's concept of the general intellect, which is the accumulation of knowledge that belongs to humans, right, is the capital, the real capital of human beings as a species, is all of our knowledge is now being privatized and turned into owned machinery by a certain class, the 1%, right, and leached out to franchise owners in a way that completely controls the formula. So that the model now of the old university is obsolete. And the idea that you would have a university, an open, one place where knowledge would be shared, it can't survive in contradiction with the logic of corporate capital, whereas knowledge will be inside the company, which is why we should talk in future classes about the university as such, and how something like a company called Microsoft wants to turn itself into its own special university with its own campus and so on. But really their logic is on proprietary software, owning knowledge, not the principle of the university, which is distributing knowledge. So this general intellect concept is really important as a mobilization for why we need a critique of the way in which knowledge operates in the digital, in the current conjuncture, which is operated with all of these commodities shaping knowledge, where they company wants to own your images and have proprietary rights to even knowledge about who your friends are, as if we all have 5,000 friends, but not the case. So what does this mean for anthropology? Anthropology is kind of a bit resistant to becoming a machine, becoming a cog in the system. It's certainly a component of the general intellect, but it's not easily privatized because it has this principle of going to have a look for yourself. But the digital kind of challenges that. That's one thing. And anthropology also becomes a bit like a corporation. It has this big apparatus of what is the general intellect of anthropology. It's a whole set of references and books and lectures and people talking about what fieldwork is, bibliographies and footnotes and debates and course guides and stacks and decimal systems and libraries full of ethnographies and monographs and chapters and essays and a whole lot of paraphernalia that makes a culture. And yet there are elements of it that would still also want to privatize and commercialize anthropology, right? So some aspects of anthropology, and this is not to be sniffed at because it's one of the greater employers of anthropologists. HR in corporate companies, they quite like to have anthropologists, and they like to have in-house anthropologists to study their inner relationships, the relationships inside an organization. And the digital companies are also interested in how culture works, how and anthropologists can contribute to that, but it's sort of like proprietary knowledge still. It's glorified market research. A lot of anthropologists are employed doing that. Am I back? Okay, I got kicked out for a second there. It seems to still have been be recording, so it won't be too bad. But I better, obviously the internet is starting to die on me again. Lost where I was up to. I was talking about anthropologists working in HR. I don't know how much of that you got. I guess one of the big employers of anthropology is anthropologists who work for companies who are interested in how culture and community work. The digital companies, Google and Amazon and Traveloka, whatever, are very concerned about dynamics of relationships, and anthropologists can contribute to that. But then it's proprietary knowledge. Then it's knowledge that stays within the company. It doesn't get shared, which is kind of incredible to think of. That we're in a university. Anthropology is a university discipline, which is all about openness and sharing. But once an anthropologist is working for a company, no, it's about in-house market research, really, and that doesn't go anywhere. In fact, it's again another example of stagnation, I suppose. So here's my little view. This part of the handwriting you can read. Because it's a quote that I'd copied out from Virginia Woolf. Actually, it's cited by Jacques Derrida, but still, it's where in his book Cinders, where he talks about take these guineas, there's 3 coins, and with it burn the college to the ground, set fire to the old hypocrisies, let the light of the burning building scare the nightingales, and incandine burn the willows. And let the daughters of educated men dance around the fire and heap armful upon armful of dead leaves upon the flames. And let their mothers lean from their upper windows and cry, let it blaze, for we have done with education. So Virginia Woolf, right, writing long ago, 100 years back, quoted by Derrida, and sounding a bit like Friedrich Nietzsche as well in 1890, talking about how, the educated people, they have something of which they're very proud, or the modern man, the bourgeois man has something of which he's very proud. He calls it education. It distinguishes him from goats. If this education is something that's going to be the general intellect, sequestered into companies and only used for the benefit of 1% of the population, it's not educated. And it's not something good. It doesn't allow freedom of women, for example. Virginia Woolf is right to say, let it burn it down, because it's not the university anymore. It's the corporate sector. All right. That's the argument, anyway. We present that argument as the alternative to the hype, but we have to think, what has the digital done, right? I want to say, at least let's consider this thought, that there's nothing really new in new media, unless you mean by new media the printing press, because that changed the way we think. Does this new media change the way we see the world? It may be too early to tell, right? Now, have things sped up? I think not. I think we need to really think about that question. Are our brains being reformatted by this attention economy, this cognitive capitalism? Are we asked to flip from one thing to another? Do we no longer spend time with material and contemplate and debate and question, stay with an argument for a while before it quickly rushes off to be either required to be, more interesting or more entertaining or the next best thing, or even worse, it's required to be vocational? What's the point of spending time watching this old stuff? How's that going to get me a job? If that's what the university has turned into, it's not the university anymore, right? So, and if the digital is anything, it's a part of that hype, right? It's about vocationalizing your degree. It's about vocationalizing knowledge. It's about sequestering knowledge to the idea of the corporate job, so that education becomes not really different than to coffee, just another stimulant for the economy, right? What difference does it make if an investor invests in a university or a coffee shop, or in Marx's example, a sausage shop, a sausage factory? An education factory or a sausage factory, so long as they make a profit, they're not concerned, right? This question is something we need to at least spend some time with considering, whether this digital hype is in the business of making a profit, or is it actual transformation in the ways we are being human, right? And that isn't answered yet, and it's probably too early to try and answer what the digital has done to us. It's certainly the case that some of these technologies extend human capacity, right? We can see different things because of the camera, right? We can slow the camera down and have slow motion replays, and we can focus in on things. We can extend human sight. We can change the time, but we don't, it's still too early to know how that change in perception really changes us, especially because so much of it is contained now in this proprietary knowledge as companies control and keep investigations into how digital media change us within the company. So this knowledge will be known by Microsoft or Google or whoever, but they won't be sharing it and debating it like we might have in the days of open philosophy or something. So yeah, this questions like old questions like division of labor and manufacturing and ownership of knowledge, ownership of the means of production, even if it's the digital means of production, have to be taken on and recognize that there's some kind of dysfunction. Can you hear the laughter in the background? I can hear the laughter in the background. The dysfunction of having kids. I've lost my train of thought anyway. So we're probably ready to stop. There's a lot of talk about the digital changing the humanities, and there's a lot of people doing interesting maps, like this map of the digital humanities on Twitter, right? And does this kind of map give us new kinds of knowledge? I'm open to it, but I'm interested. I'm also pretty much in line with, as ever, the teaching of Gayatri Spivak. She's made a very sensible point, a bit shocking, but not really, that the digital humanities is also hype, right? This is in a lecture she made to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, even though they're not really that connected to Rosa Luxemburg. I can't say I get everything that Spivak says, because the point is that she's throwing things out for argument, right? Her thinking is dialectic, and like our thinking, it should be. You explore an issue, right? Like debating whether or not the digital changes things, whether or not cognitive capitalism is transforming what it is to be human, or containing it, whether or not capital is speeding up or stagnant, right? But this push to understand things better is kind of contradicted by this notion of the digital humanities, because that simply quantifies meaning. And that means it's no longer the humanities. The humanities is about calling to account things like quantification, data mining, scrubbing of tests electronically, survey work, right? Or reading with Google, reading these summarized 10 books in 10 minutes kind of emails, right? And the translation machine, the things that we're using as tools are also a loss of the skill of debate and of reading carefully. The patient and pleasurable task of the humanities is to read and think carefully about what it is to be, to know, to study, and to teach, right? So digital anthropology will still have to take the time to have a look at the world, and look at how the translation machine works, and look at how the digital objects are either not new, or to what degree they're new, or different, digital. The apparatus, or the apparatus, the institution, the infrastructure in which knowledge is now placed in institutions is something to be examined. We have to have a look at that carefully ourselves. That was what the humanities would be. The humanities would be a questioning of the way in which the digital is rolled out in the corporate sector. So the digital humanities wouldn't be a thing, but the humanities of the digital would be a critical way of thinking how our lives are being transformed by, or not transformed by, these technologies. I say it to you and stop. That's be the argument to think about anyway. Thanks.